At 4 a.m. on the 58th floor, a cleaning lady was about to save a billionaire's son, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. Welcome to SoulThread Stories, where we weave narratives that reveal the extraordinary power hidden in ordinary moments. The silence in Sterling Global's executive wing was almost sacred at this hour. 48 floors below, the city still slept, but up here in the clouds, Anya Sharma moved like a quiet ghost through polished marble hallways. Her cart wheels whispered against the floor as she worked her way through corner offices, each one larger than her entire apartment. She had perfected the art of being invisible, wiping down mahogany desks without disturbing perfectly arranged papers, polishing windows that framed million-dollar views she'd never afford to see from her own home. Anya knew every corner of this floor, every routine. She knew which executives left coffee rings on their desks, which ones worked late enough to nod at her with tired acknowledgement. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the usual emptiness carried a weight she couldn't name. She was reaching for the handle of the CEO's office when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze and her heart slam against her ribs. Not the typical hum of air conditioning or the distant elevator chime. This was something primal, desperate, a child's strangled cry cutting through the corporate quiet like a knife through silk. Inside Victor Sterling's private office, behind those imposing double doors, someone small was in terrible trouble. Anya's hands trembled as she pushed the door open, and what she saw shattered every assumption she'd ever made about power and helplessness. Victor Sterling, the man whose name commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, whose decisions moved stock markets, stood frozen like a statue, his usually commanding presence reduced to pure terror. In his arms, a small boy with dark hair was fighting for each breath. His tiny hands clawed weakly at his throat, his face turning a shade of blue that Anya recognized with sick familiarity. The same color her brother's face had turned years ago when his condition first emerged, when she'd learned that love alone wasn't enough to keep someone breathing. "What do I do?" Victor's voice cracked, raw with a fear that money couldn't buy away from. "Please, what do I do?" For 15 years, Anya had cleaned around the edges of other people's lives, invisible and ignored. She watched powerful men make decisions that affected thousands while she emptied their trash cans. But now, as this tiny boy gasped for air in his father's shaking arms, everything flipped. The cleaning lady stepped forward, and the billionaire stepped back. Because sometimes the person with the most power in the room is the one nobody sees coming. Most people who worked in Sterling Global's tower never really saw Anya Sharma. She arrived before the sun rose and left after most had gone home, moving through their world like a shadow that kept their lives pristine. For 3 years, she perfected this dance, timing her rounds so she never interrupted important calls, never made eye contact that lasted too long, never left a trace that she'd been there except for the spotless surfaces and empty wastebaskets. But Anya was far from empty herself. Every night, she studied medical journals she'd checked out from the public library, teaching herself about conditions she'd never be able to afford to treat. She watched YouTube videos of physical therapy techniques on her cracked phone screen during lunch breaks. She'd memorized medication schedules and dietary restrictions not for any certification, but because knowledge was the only insurance policy she could afford. Her work ethic wasn't just about keeping a job. It was about dignity. While other cleaning staff rushed through their duties, Anya treated each office like it mattered. Because in her world, this job was everything. It was the difference between keeping the lights on and choosing between electricity and groceries. The contrast hit her every single day like a physical force. She'd spend her morning wiping down a marble conference table that cost more than she'd make in 5 years, then go home to a kitchen table held up by phone books. She'd polish leather chairs that cost more than her monthly rent, then sit on a couch she'd found on the sidewalk and reupholstered herself. But the hardest part wasn't the money. It was the invisibility. watching executives discuss million-dollar charity donations while she scrubbed their floors, knowing that same money could change her entire family's life. Hearing them complain about minor inconveniences while she counted pills for her brother and hoped they'd last until her next paycheck. The gulf between their worlds wasn't just about wealth. It was about the simple luxury of being seen as human. Anya's expertise had been earned in the hardest classroom imaginable, necessity. When her younger brother David was 8, a fever had damaged parts of his brain that controlled swallowing and muscle coordination. The doctors had used fancy terms like dysphagia and motor planning disorder, but what they really meant was that David could choke on his own saliva and their insurance wouldn't cover the help he needed. So Anya became his therapist, his nurse, his advocate. She learned to read the subtle signs of aspiration, to position him correctly during meals, to clear his airway when food went down the wrong way. She studied speech pathology textbooks and practiced techniques until her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd trained for years. She learned that love combined with knowledge could work miracles, even when money couldn't. Every successful swallow, every clear breath, every small victory had been earned through sleepless nights and relentless learning. David was 22 now, living independently with her support. Proof that sometimes the best medical care comes from someone who simply refuses to give up. Victor Sterling's reputation preceded him into every room like a cold wind. At 44, he'd built Sterling Global from a small tech startup into a multinational powerhouse through what business magazines called surgical precision and what his competitors called ruthless efficiency. He didn't make friends. He made strategic partnerships. He didn't have conversations. He held negotiations. Board members respected him. Employees feared him. Stock analysts praised his quarterly results while wondering if he had a human heart beneath those perfectly tailored suits. Victor had cultivated this image deliberately. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was expensive. He worked 18-hour days not because he loved the work, but because control required constant vigilance. He ate lunch at his desk while reviewing acquisition reports. He took calls from Tokyo at midnight and from London at dawn. His calendar was scheduled in 15-minute increments, each block optimized for maximum productivity. But all of that fell apart the moment his son needed him. Leo had been born with cerebral palsy that affected his ability to coordinate the muscles needed for safe swallowing. At 5 years old, he required careful positioning, thickened liquids, and constant monitoring during meals. Victor had hired the best nannies, the most qualified specialists, the top pediatric therapists money could buy. But money couldn't buy intuition, and tonight, money had failed him completely. His regular nanny had called in with a family emergency. The backup service couldn't provide someone until morning. Victor had thought he could handle one night. How hard could it be to give his son a bottle? He'd watched the specialist work hundreds of times, but watching and doing were entirely different universes. The moment Leo started struggling, Victor's carefully constructed world crumbled. His hands, so steady during million-dollar negotiations, shook as he tried to position his son correctly. His voice, which commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, cracked with helplessness. Leo's breathing became labored, then desperate. His small body convulsed as he fought for air, and Victor felt the full weight of his own inadequacy. All his power, all his wealth, all his influence. None of it mattered when his child couldn't breathe. The man who never asked for help from anyone found himself begging a cleaning lady to save his son's life. In that moment, Victor Sterling discovered that the hardest negotiations happen with fate, and money means nothing when time runs out. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking on the word he rarely spoke. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help him." For the first time in decades, Victor Sterling was completely, utterly powerless. Anya moved with a calmness that surprised even her. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning solutions, became gentle instruments of precision as she carefully took Leo from his father's trembling arms. She could feel the child's fear through his tiny frame, the way his muscles tense with each difficult breath. "He's aspirated," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Food went down the wrong pipe. We need to help him cough it up, but gently." She positioned Leo on her lap, supporting his head with one hand while tilting him slightly forward. Her other hand moved his back, delivering firm but careful percussion. Not the dramatic backslapping she'd seen in movies, but a precise technique she'd learned through necessity with David. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice taking on the same soothing tone she'd used countless times with her brother. "Just let it out. You're safe now." Leo's body shook with a wet, productive cough, and a small amount of thickened liquid came up. Anya immediately turned him to the side, making sure nothing could flow back into his airway. She kept one ear close to his chest, listening to his breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his small rib cage. "That's it," she murmured, beginning to hum a soft melody. The same lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, the one she'd hummed to David during his worst moments. The tune seemed to calm Leo, his breathing becoming more regular as she held him against her chest. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, checking his color, feeling for the telltale vibrations in his throat that might indicate more obstruction. She adjusted his position slightly, supported his head at just the right angle to keep his airway clear while allowing any remaining liquid to drain safely. Leo's eyes began to flutter open, and when they did, they locked onto Anya's face with a trust that only children could give so completely to a stranger. She smiled down at him, still humming, her thumb gently stroking his forehead. "There you are," she whispered. "You're okay. You're gonna be just fine." Victor watched this transformation in complete silence, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. This woman, someone he'd never really noticed despite passing her in these hallways for 3 years, had just accomplished what all his money and panic could not. She hadn't just saved Leo's life. She had done it with a competence and tenderness that made Victor realize how little he actually knew about caring for his own son. In less than 5 minutes, she had turned a medical emergency into a moment of quiet safety, her invisible hands working a miracle he would never forget. The cleaning lady had just taught the billionaire the most valuable lesson of his life. Sometimes the most important expertise comes in the most unexpected places. Type invisible if you've ever been overlooked because of your job. Let's show how many heroes work in the shadows. Here at SoulThread Stories, we believe every person has untold strength. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories that honor the unseen heroes among us. By 8 a.m., the story had already begun to change. Did you hear about Sterling and the cleaning lady? The words floated through the executive break room like smoke, carrying with them the particular energy that only office gossip could generate. Apparently, she was in his office all night. The truth, that Anya had saved Leo's life, became something entirely different as it passed from mouth to mouth. Some versions had Victor collapsing from exhaustion. Others whispered about inappropriate relationships and boundary crossings. A few creative storytellers suggested Anya had been stealing when she discovered Victor's medical emergency. Each retelling stripped away more of the actual heroism and replaced it with speculation that fit more comfortably into people's existing assumptions about power, class, and what happens when worlds collide unexpectedly. "I always thought there was something off about her," someone murmured near the elevator banks. "Too quiet, too observant. You know how they can be." The rumors weren't just idle chatter. They were the corporate immune system activating against disruption. Sterling Global had operated for 15 years on a carefully maintained hierarchy where everyone knew their place and stayed in it. Executives made decisions. Middle management implemented them. Support staff remained invisible. This structure wasn't just about efficiency. It was about comfort, predictability, and the preservation of power dynamics that made everyone feel secure in their roles. Anya's sudden visibility threatened that comfort in ways that went beyond individual jealousy or resentment. When the cleaning lady could do something the CEO could not, it raised uncomfortable questions about competence, value, and who really mattered in the daily operations of their world. The whispers weren't really about Anya at all. They were about fear. Fear that maybe the people they'd trained themselves not to see might actually be more valuable than anyone had imagined. Fear that kindness and capability might matter more than degrees and stock options. Fear that their carefully constructed world might not be as solid as they believed. By lunchtime, Anya could feel the weight of every stare as she moved through the building. Conversation stopped when she approached. Elevators suddenly became full when she tried to board. The invisibility that had once protected her now felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She'd spent years perfecting the art of blending into backgrounds, but now she was a story everyone was telling, and none of the versions sounded like her life. 3 days later, the call came through the building's internal phone system to the custodial office, a place Victor Sterling had probably never known existed. Anya Sharma to the executive floor immediately. The supervisor who delivered the message looked as confused as Anya felt. In 3 years, no cleaning staff member had ever been summoned to Victor's office during business hours. The very request violated every protocol about maintaining invisible boundaries between their worlds. Anya rode the elevator to the 58th floor with her heart hammering against her ribs, wondering if she was about to be fired for overstepping, sued for touching his son without permission, or worse, completely misunderstood and blamed for whatever story the rumors had created. Victor was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows when she knocked, his back to the door, his usually perfect posture showing signs of the sleepless nights that had followed their encounter. When he turned around, Anya saw something in his expression she'd never witnessed in any of the executives she'd observed over the years. Genuine humility. "Ms. Sharma," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to a man accustomed to commanding rather than requesting. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved Leo's life." He moved to his desk, but instead of sitting behind it in his usual position of authority, he remained standing, as if trying to eliminate the physical barriers between them. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what happened, about how completely helpless I was, about how you knew exactly what to do when I couldn't even think clearly." His voice carried a weight of recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. "I realize that I've been running a company for 15 years, making decisions that affect thousands of employees, and I never bothered to know the people who keep this place running." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. Victor opened a folder on his desk, revealing documents that Anya couldn't quite read from where she stood. "I want to offer you a position as Leo's primary caregiver, full-time with a salary of $85,000 annually, complete health benefits, and a budget for any additional training or equipment you might need." The numbers hit Anya like a physical blow. $85,000 was more than she'd made in the past 3 years combined. It was the difference between survival and security, between watching every penny and being able to help David with his own medical expenses. You would work directly with Leo's medical team, coordinate his therapy schedules, and provide the kind of care that clearly comes naturally to you, Victor continued, his words coming faster now, as if he was afraid she might refuse before he could finish explaining. "Your office would be adjacent to mine, with specialized equipment and everything you'd need to ensure Leo's safety and development." But even as the life-changing offer settled over her like a warm blanket, Anya felt the familiar whisper of doubt that followed her through every opportunity she'd ever been offered. She was a high school graduate with a cleaning certificate and hard-earned experience caring for her brother. This was a world of advanced degrees and professional credentials, of board meetings and corporate strategies she didn't understand. What if she failed? What if Leo needed something beyond her capabilities? What if she disappointed the man who was offering her a chance to change her entire life? The gap between her current reality and this opportunity felt as vast as the city spread out beyond Victor's windows. Beautiful, tempting, and possibly too far to cross safely. 2 weeks later, Anya stood in what had once been a storage room adjacent to Victor's office, now transformed into something that looked like a cross between a medical facility and a child's playroom. Adaptive seating lined one wall, positioned to support Leo at various angles for different activities. A refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, stocked with thickened liquids and special formulations designed for safe swallowing. The morning light streaming through newly installed windows revealed specialized utensils, communication boards, and therapy equipment that probably cost more than Anya's annual rent. Everything had been chosen not for aesthetics, but for Leo's specific needs. A reminder that this wasn't just about luxury, but about creating an environment where a vulnerable child could thrive. The transformation of the space mirrored something happening in Anya herself, though it was far less visible and much more complicated. Learning the corporate systems felt like trying to speak a foreign language while blindfolded. Electronic scheduling systems that seemed intuitive to others required careful study for Anya to master. Coordinating with Leo's team of specialists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, and pediatric nutritionists, meant learning to communicate in medical terminology she previously only encountered in library books. But the real challenge wasn't technical, it was psychological. Every email she sent was reviewed 3 times for errors. Every phone call with a medical professional required notes and preparation to ensure she sounded competent. She found herself constantly fighting the voice in her head that whispered she didn't belong in conference calls with people who had spent decades studying what she'd learned through necessity. Yet slowly, something remarkable began to emerge in the intersection of her hard-earned experience and these new professional resources. Anya discovered she could advocate for Leo in ways that combined medical knowledge with intuitive understanding of his individual needs. She learned to translate between the clinical language of his therapy team and the practical reality of his daily care. She developed systems that maximized Leo's comfort while ensuring his safety, created schedules that balanced his medical needs with opportunities for play and development, and established routines that gave him predictability in a world that often felt chaotic and overwhelming. Most importantly, she was building something that couldn't be taught in any professional program. Relationship of genuine trust and affection with a child who had learned to be wary of new caregivers. Leo began reaching for Anya when he felt uncertain. He would calm the sound of her voice during difficult medical procedures. His eyes would light up when she entered the room, and he started making small vocalizations that his speech therapist recognized as attempts to communicate specifically with her. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon, when Leo successfully swallowed his entire lunch without any episodes of aspiration. It was a small victory by medical standards, but for Anya, it represented everything she'd hoped to achieve. Proof that love combined with knowledge could create genuine progress. When she called Victor to share the news, she heard something in his voice that had been absent during all their previous professional interactions. Pure joy at his son's success, mixed with gratitude for the woman who had made it possible. Brenda Maxwell had been Victor Sterling's executive assistant for 12 years, a position she built into something approaching personal ownership of his professional life. She coordinated his schedule with military precision, managed his communications with diplomatic skill, and protected his time with the fierce devotion of someone who had made his success her own primary purpose. At 52, Brenda had sacrificed potential relationships, family opportunities, and personal ambitions to become indispensable to a man who rarely remembered to thank her for the 1,000 small services she performed daily. Her identity was so intertwined with his career that Victor's victories felt like her own, and any threat to their professional partnership felt like an attack on her entire sense of self. Anya's sudden prominence in Victor's life triggered every territorial instinct Brenda had developed over more than a decade of gatekeeping his access and managing his priorities. The shift had been subtle at first, Victor asking Brenda to clear time in his schedule for Leo-related meetings, then requesting that she coordinate with Anya on medical appointments that required his presence. Finally, the devastating realization that Victor was making decisions about his son without consulting her at all, turning instead to a woman who had been invisible just weeks earlier. Brenda began her campaign of doubt with the precision of someone who understood exactly how corporate culture functioned. She never directly criticized Anya, which would have seemed unprofessional and petty. Instead, she asked carefully crafted questions designed to plant seeds of uncertainty about Anya's qualifications, motivations, and long-term intentions. "I hope Victor isn't being taken advantage of during such a vulnerable time," she would murmur to other executives during casual conversations. It's so easy for people to exploit a parent's desperation, especially when significant money is involved. She shared concerns about proper background checks and professional certifications, always framing her doubts as protective worry for Victor rather than personal resentment. She questioned whether someone with Anya's limited formal education could really handle the complex medical and administrative responsibilities the position required. The whispers found fertile ground among board members who had already been uncomfortable with Victor's impulsive decision to elevate a custodial worker to such a prominent position. These were people who measured worth through diplomas and professional achievements, who had built their own careers on credentials and networking rather than natural ability or life experience. They began to question Victor's judgment not just about Anya, but about his fitness to lead a major corporation, while apparently being influenced by personal emotions and family concerns that have remained completely separate from business decisions. The resistance wasn't just about class or education. It was about maintaining a world where merit was measured by familiar standards and change happened through established channels rather than unexpected demonstrations of competence that challenged everything they thought they knew about value and worth. Type courage. If you've ever taken a leap that scared you, share this with someone who needs to see what bravery looks like. At SoulThread Stories, we craft these narratives to remind you that your courage matters. Subscribe if you believe in the power of taking chances on yourself. The Children's Medical Foundation Gala was exactly the kind of event where Victor Sterling typically shined. 500 of the city's most influential people gathered in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, each ticket costing more than most people's monthly salary, all in service of a cause that looked good on corporate social responsibility reports. This year, however, Victor had made an unprecedented decision. Instead of attending alone or with a carefully selected business associate, he had invited Anya to accompany him, wanted to introduce Leo's caregiver to the medical professionals and philanthropists who would be present. "She needs to understand the broader community that supports children like Leo," he explained to his assistant when requesting the additional invitation. But the real reason was simpler and more personal. He wanted people to see the woman who had transformed his son's life, to witness the competence and compassion he discovered beneath their assumptions. Anya had spent her entire savings on a simple black dress that looked elegant enough for the occasion, but the moment she stepped into ballroom, she felt the weight of being utterly out of place. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over women wearing jewelry that could pay off her student loans, men in tuxedos that cost more than her annual grocery budget. But it wasn't the luxury that made her uncomfortable. It was the immediate recognition in people's eyes as Victor introduced her, followed quickly by the kind of social math that reduced her to a walking question mark about propriety and place. The warfare began subtly, as it always did in circles where direct confrontation was considered vulgar. Eyes lingered a moment too long before looking away. Conversations paused and she approached, resumed with careful neutrality when she passed. So interesting that Victor brought his staff, she heard someone murmur near the silent auction tables. The word staff carried enough disdain to fill a courtroom. A woman in pearls and practiced charm, approached with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You must be so grateful for Mr. Sterling's generosity. It's wonderful when successful people give back to their employees." The words sounded like compliments but felt like paper cuts. Small, precise, and designed to remind Anya exactly where these people thought she belonged. Another couple, both physicians according to their name tags, engaged her in conversation that quickly became an interrogation disguised as professional curiosity. "Where did you receive your training in pediatric care?" When Anya explained her experience with her brother, their polite interest turned to barely concealed skepticism. "How fascinating. And you feel qualified to handle complex medical situations based on family experience?" The questions weren't really questions. They were judgments wrapped in the language of concern, designed to expose what they saw as Victor's poor decision-making and her own presumption in accepting a position they believed she hadn't earned. Through it all, Anya kept her focus on Leo, who sat quietly in his adaptive stroller, occasionally reaching for her hand when the crowd became overwhelming. She answered questions with dignity, explained her approach to his care with confidence, and refused to apologize for knowledge she'd earned through necessity rather than textbooks. When Leo grew tired, she excused herself from a particularly condescending conversation with a pediatric specialist who kept referring to proper professional protocols, and found a quiet corner where she could help him with his evening medication. As she positioned his cup at exactly the right angle and hummed the soft melody that always helped him swallow, she realized that none of the judgments in that ballroom mattered more than this child's trust in her hands. The people in this room might question her credentials, but Leo knew she was exactly where she belonged. The Meridian acquisition should have been Victor's greatest triumph. 18 months of negotiations to purchase a key competitor, valued at $2.8 billion, with the potential to expand Sterling Global's market share by 40% across 3 international markets. Instead, it became a disaster that nearly destroyed everything he'd built. The morning after the gala, Victor arrived at his office to find his legal team in complete chaos. Somehow, their confidential negotiation strategy had been leaked to Meridian's board 24 hours before the final contract signing. Not just basic talking points, but detailed financial projections, backup offers, and most damaging of all, private communications between Victor and his advisors discussing Meridian's weaknesses they planned to exploit. Meridian's executives had used this insider knowledge to completely restructure the deal, demanding terms that would have been financially devastating for Sterling Global. Worse, they'd shared selected portions of the leaked information with business journalists, making Victor appear manipulative and predatory in ways that would damage his reputation for years. The acquisition collapsed within hours, taking with it not just 18 months of work, but Sterling Global's stock price, several related contracts, and Victor's credibility with his own board of directors. The financial loss was catastrophic, but the betrayal cut deeper. Someone inside his inner circle had sold him out completely. As Victor sat in emergency board meetings, watching directors who had once trusted his judgment now questioning every decision he'd made over the past year, his mind began to work in the cold, calculating patterns that had once made him successful and now threatened to destroy everything good he'd recently discovered. The warm, vulnerable man who had learned to ask for help disappeared, replaced by the suspicious corporate warrior who trusted no one and questioned everyone's motives. The board members pointed questions about his recent personal distractions and questionable personnel decisions, fed a growing paranoia that maybe his enemies were closer than he'd realized. Within 48 hours, Victor had transformed back into the granite man Anya had first encountered, cold, distant, and absolutely convinced that kindness was weakness and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He stopped visiting Leo during the day, communicating through Brenda instead of speaking directly with Anya. He canceled their weekly planning meetings and replaced them with formal reports delivered through his assistant. The collaborative partnership, they'd been building disappeared behind walls of corporate protocol and emotional distance. The whispers that had always surrounded Anya's position grew louder and more insistent. How convenient that a major security breach had occurred just months after a custodial worker had been given unprecedented access to the executive floor. How suspicious that someone with no formal business training had suddenly gained intimate knowledge of Victor's schedule, his priorities, his vulnerabilities. "I'm not saying she's involved," Brenda said carefully during a closed-door meeting with board members, "but we have to consider all possibilities." She was in the building during all the sensitive meetings about Meridian. She had access to Victor's office when he wasn't there. And frankly, people in desperate financial situations sometimes make choices they wouldn't normally consider. The accusation was never made directly, but it didn't need to be. In an environment where trust had been shattered and everyone was suspect, Anya's recent elevation from invisible employee to trusted confidant made her the most convenient target for blame. She had become the perfect scapegoat. Someone with access but no allies. Someone whose loyalty could be questioned without significant corporate consequences. Someone whose removal would signal that Victor was taking the security breach seriously without actually having to acknowledge his own failures of judgment. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Meridian disaster. Victor's calendar simply read, "Personnel discussion, confidential." But Anya knew what it meant the moment Brenda delivered the formal request for a presence in the conference room. She'd watched the transformation happen day by day. Victor's gradual retreat behind professional barriers. The return of the cold efficiency she'd witnessed during her cleaning days. The way he now spoke about Leo's care in clinical terms that stripped away all the warmth they'd built together. When she entered the conference room, Victor was already seated at the head of the table with 2 people she'd never seen before, a woman in an expensive suit carrying a medical credentials portfolio, and a man with the kind of rigid posture that suggested military or institutional care background. "Ms. Sharma," Victor began, his voice carrying none of the gratitude or partnership that had characterized their recent interactions. "I've been reviewing Leo's care requirements with medical professionals, and they recommended some changes to ensure he receives the highest level of specialized attention." The woman opened her portfolio, revealing certifications in pediatric nursing, special needs care, and developmental therapy, credentials that represented years of formal education and professional experience that Anya had never possessed and could never obtain. "Jennifer has 15 years of experience with children who have similar conditions to Leo's," Victor continued, not meeting Anya's eyes. "She's worked at Children's Hospital, completed advanced training in assistive technology, and comes highly recommended by 3 pediatric specialists." The man introduced himself as a behavioral therapist with a master's degree in developmental psychology, someone who could provide Leo with evidence-based interventions and measurable progress indicators that would ensure his development followed established protocols. Victor's words washed over Anya like cold water, each professionally phrased sentence carrying the same message. She was being replaced by people who looked better on paper, who could reassure board members and satisfy corporate liability concerns, who represented the safe, credentialed choice that would protect Victor from further accusations of poor judgment. "Your position will be terminated at the end of next week," he concluded, sliding a severance package across the table. "You'll receive 6 months' salary and excellent references for future employment opportunities." Anya walked back to her office, Leo's office, in a daze that felt like drowning in slow motion. Everything she'd built, everything she'd learned, everything she'd come to believe about her own worth was being boxed up and discarded because trust had become too expensive for Victor to maintain. She began packing her personal belongings with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. The adaptive utensils she'd selected specifically for Leo's grip strength. The communication card she created with pictures of his favorite activities. The special blanket she brought from home because it helped him sleep during his afternoon rest periods. Each item represented hours of thought, research, and care that would be replaced by professional protocols and standardized equipment. The relationship she'd built with Leo, based on intuition, affection, and hard-earned expertise, would be replaced by clinical efficiency and evidence-based practices. As she folded the soft blue sweater she kept in the office for Leo's comfort during medical procedures, Anya felt the dream she'd barely allowed herself to believe in crumbling completely. For a few months, she'd imagined a future where her knowledge mattered, where her care could change a life, where she could be seen as valuable rather than invisible. She was placing the last items in her cardboard box when Leo rolled into the room in his wheelchair, pushed by the afternoon aide who had been instructed to bring him for his usual snack time. Leo's eyes immediately found Anya's face, then the boxes, then her face again. His expression shifted from joy at seeing her to confusion, and then to something that looked remarkably like heartbreak in a 5-year-old's features. He reached for her with both arms, making the soft vocalization that had become his way of calling her name. When she knelt beside his chair, he pressed his small hands against her cheeks with the desperate intensity of a child who understood that something precious was being taken away. In that moment, Anya realized that her own broken heart was nothing compared to the betrayal this vulnerable little boy was experiencing. He had learned to trust her completely, and now the adults in his world were teaching him that even love could be a temporary convenience, subject to forces beyond his understanding or control. Hit like if you believe loyalty should be rewarded. Subscribe if you think good people deserve better endings. SoulThread Stories exist because we believe these human connections matter. Your support keeps authentic stories like this alive. The truth came out the way it always does in corporate investigations. Slowly, then all at once, like a dam finally giving way under pressure. 3 weeks after Anya's dismissal, Sterling Global Security Team completed their forensic analysis of Meridian leak. The digital trail led not to some desperate employee seeking financial gain, but to Harold Westbrook, a board member who had been quietly orchestrating Victor's downfall for over 2 years. Westbrook had been feeding information to Meridian through a complex network of shell companies and business contacts, positioning himself to benefit from the acquisition's failure through short-selling Sterling Global stock and strategic investments in Meridian's competitors. The leaked documents hadn't come from Anya's supposed access to sensitive information. They'd come directly from board meetings that Westbrook had attended as a trusted insider. The financial motive was substantial, but the personal vendetta ran deeper. Westbrook had wanted Victor's position as CEO for years, believing his own Harvard MBA and family connections made him more qualified than Victor's aggressive upstart approach to business. When Victor's leadership had consistently outperformed expectations, Westbrook had decided to create the failures he couldn't wait for naturally. The Meridian sabotage was just a final move in a longer game designed to make Victor appear unstable, paranoid, and unfit to lead. The plan had worked perfectly, except for one detail Westbrook had never anticipated. Victor's transformation from ruthless executive to vulnerable father had made him more human, not weaker, and that humanity had earned him loyalties that pure business relationships never could. The investigation revealed that Brenda Maxwell had been the unwitting accomplice in Victor's betrayal, though her motivations had been completely different from Westbrook's calculated malice. Her 12 years of devoted service to Victor had created a blind spot that made her vulnerable to manipulation by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her fierce protectiveness. Westbrook had approached Brenda with carefully crafted concerns about questionable influences on Victor's decision-making, particularly regarding his son's care. He presented himself as a fellow guardian of Victor's best interests, someone worried about protecting the CEO from people who might take advantage of his paternal instincts. "I'm only thinking of Victor's reputation," Westbrook had told her during private conversations that felt like professional consultations, but were actually intelligence-gathering sessions. "People are talking about his judgment. The board is concerned. We need to document everything to protect him from potential liability. Brenda had provided information about Victor's schedule, his meetings with Anya, his emotional state during difficult periods, all with a sincere belief that she was helping to shield him from criticism and potential problems. She'd never imagined that her detailed observations were being used to time attacks on his vulnerabilities and manipulate his responses to manufactured crises. When Victor saw the evidence of how thoroughly he'd been deceived, the revelation hit him like a physical blow. Harold Westbrook, someone he'd trusted with the most sensitive business decisions for 5 years, had been systematically destroying everything Victor had built, using Victor's own emotions and family concerns as weapons against him. But the deeper realization was more devastating. In his paranoia about betrayal, he had betrayed the one person who had never asked for anything except a chance to care for his son. He'd chosen suspicion over trust, credentials over character, corporate protection over human loyalty. In trying to safeguard himself from enemies, he had become his own worst enemy by pushing away the people who actually care about his family. Anya had been completely innocent, and he had destroyed her dream to protect himself from threats that had never come from her direction at all. Victor found Anya at the public library on a Thursday evening, sitting at one of the computer terminals with a stack of medical journals beside her, still learning, still growing, still refusing to let disappointment stop her from becoming better at the things she discovered she was born to do. When she looked up and saw him standing there in his expensive suit among the worn chairs and fluorescent lighting, her first instinct was to gather her things and leave. But something in his expression, a humility she'd never seen during their professional relationship, made her stay. "I know," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of every mistake he'd made over the past month. "I know who really betrayed me, and I know that I betrayed you. I know that I chose fear over trust, and I know that I may have lost the best thing that ever happened to Leo." He sat down across from her, not as a CEO summoning an employee, but as a man who had finally understood that the most important conversations happen between equals, no matter what their job titles might suggest. "I want to ask you to come back, but I need you to know that I'm not the same person who fired you. I've spent the last 3 weeks learning to take care of Leo myself. Not because I had to, but because I needed to understand what I'd been missing all along." The change in Victor went beyond apologies and explanations. For the first time in his adult life, he had stepped away from 18-hour workdays to sit on the floor with his son, learning to see the world through Leo's eyes. He'd figured out how to position Leo for safe swallowing not by reading medical reports, but by paying attention to his son's comfort and responses. He'd discovered that Leo had a sense of humor that emerged when he felt safe, that his son could communicate volumes with just a look when someone took the time to really listen. Victor had learned to hum the same lullaby Anya had used, not because it was medically prescribed, but because it made Leo smile. "I'm not offering you a job," Victor continued, his words careful and sincere. "I'm asking if you consider becoming Leo's partner in this. Someone who works with me, not for me, to help him become everything he's capable of being." The new arrangement wasn't about corporate hierarchies or professional credentials. It was about combining Victor's resources with Anya's intuitive expertise, his access to medical specialists with her understanding of Leo's individual personality, his ability to open doors with her gift for recognizing what truly mattered. They would make decisions together, learn from each other's perspectives, and build Leo's care around his needs rather than around systems designed to protect adults from liability or criticism. Victor would handle the business side of medical coordination, insurance requirements, and equipment procurement, while Anya would focus on the daily realities of helping Leo grow, communicate, and discover his own potential. This wasn't about Anya climbing corporate ladders or gaining status symbols that had never really mattered to her anyway. Her true victory was quieter and more profound. She had changed how a powerful man understood love, responsibility, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize genuine worth. She had shown Victor that expertise comes from many sources, that wisdom can emerge from necessity as easily as from formal education, and that the most important qualifications for caring for a vulnerable child are patience, attention, and the willingness to put his needs above adult convenience. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that real strength isn't about control or dominance. It's about showing up consistently, day after day, with hands ready to help and a heart willing to love without conditions or expectations. Share this if you believe everyone deserves a second chance. Subscribe to SoulThread Stories if stories about real human connection matter to you. These narratives take weeks to research and craft. Your support keeps authentic storytelling alive and helps us weave more threads that connect us all. The morning routine had become something neither Victor nor Anya could have imagined during those first desperate moments in his office. Victor would arrive at Leo's room by 7, not to check his son off a list of parental obligations, but because these quiet moments before the day's demands had become the anchor of his entire schedule. Anya would already be there, not because she had to be, but because Leo's bright smile when he saw her each morning had become as essential to her as breathing. Together, they would help Leo with his morning exercises, coordinate his medication schedule, and plan activities that balance his therapeutic needs with the simple joy of being a child who was loved unconditionally. The change in their relationship had rippled outward in ways that surprised everyone. Victor's board meetings now included breaks when Leo needed attention. His office door stayed open more often than closed. He learned to delegate responsibilities that had once seemed crucial, but were really just attempts to control outcomes he'd never been able to control anyway. Leo was thriving in ways that medical charts couldn't measure. His physical progress was steady and encouraging, but the real transformation was in his confidence, his willingness to try new things, and his obvious joy in having two adults who worked together rather than competing for influence in his life. His communication had expanded beyond what his speech therapist had predicted, partly because he had people who listened not just to his words, but to his intentions, his preferences, and his growing sense of himself as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. He had learned to trust that when he reached for help, capable hands would always be there to catch him. Victor had discovered that leading with empathy didn't make him weaker in business. It made him more effective, more creative, and more respected by employees who had spent years waiting for permission to bring their full humanity to work. Sterling Global's culture shifted subtly but significantly, becoming a place where people's personal challenges were met with support rather than suspicion, where diverse forms of expertise were valued alongside traditional credentials. The woman who had once been invisible was now irreplaceable, not because she climbed any ladder or earned any title, but because she'd proven that the most powerful force in any workplace is someone who genuinely cares about making life better for the people around them. Sometimes the most powerful people in the world are the ones nobody sees coming. And sometimes saving someone else is exactly how you save yourself. This is SoulThread Stories, where every thread matters and every story connects us to our shared humanity.